August the 25th, 2022. Guys, this is an article. It's a couple of days old, but it says the U.S. is now 30 days away from a possible railroad labor strike. If you go back to July 18th, in the week before that, I'd done a couple of videos about that strike coming up. And the name of the video I did on July 18th, you can look it up, it's Rail Strike Averted. They had went through the processes of 30 days negotiations. They couldn't get anything done, so they had called a strike. Well, by law, they had to do a 60-day delay, 30 days for negotiations. If negotiations weren't reached, a 30-day cooling-off period. And all of this was set up partially by Congress back in 1991 under the Bush administration. They had a railroad strike, but guys, it lasted only about a day in Congress. I think it was one of the most bipartisan bills passed in history, probably. They saw what was about to happen with the economy in the nation, and both sides of the Democrats and Republicans voted to pass this strike bill, or labor bill, whatever it was, railroad strike bill, and kind of forced everyone back to work. Now, they can do this again, but again, July 18th was the video when they averted the strike. Now, we went through August the 18th. What is September? Well, on September 16th ends the 60-day government moratorium. In other words, the 30-day negotiation period, 30-day cooling off period. But there's not a lot of signs that they've come to much of a reason not to strike. So the question would be, and it's a big question, what will the Congress do now? The president would have to sign off on it, but we don't know how the nation's going. Farmers are already reporting, and we've talked about it since last May, and earlier than that in the spring when people started trying to plant gardens. There was a shortage, fertilizer, and for the cattle folks, there was a shortage, and the other food producers, there was a shortage of grain for the animals. And now they're saying that even though the strike was averted, all of those problems, as far as transportation, not only just to trucks to go from Amazon to out to the warehouses and the trains involved in getting it to the warehouses for the trucks to get, all of that was already in pretty much chaos. And you're looking at a train wreck. This was in about the time these strikes were being negotiated this year in Heifer, Texas. And we saw another wreck, big fertilizer train was overturned. Now, so with a different administration, what will happen in 3 weeks? September the 16th. That's the end of the 60 days that are required. If I'm not mistaken, and you can look it up, the Congress may have power to force a negotiation or force a settlement and demand people go back to work. Well, if you've kept up with the news, there's already a lot of very unhappy railroad workers. They're not getting paid like they used to. If you remember in the past, you guys that have been in the railroad or had family in it for years, it used to be one of the top jobs, very well paid, employees taken care of. But now the complaints are the pay is poor, the work is over demanding, real long shifts, terrible conditions, and just a lot of disgruntled folks already. So if the government comes in September 16th and forces these folks to go back to work, the number of people that will be disgruntled and the amount of unhappiness will be seen immediately in the supply chain. When you get workers that are being forced to do something, everything's going to slow down to a grinding halt anyway. It's just human nature. You and I would probably be the same way. More than likely, probably 100% sure that most of us would be, unless you're just in that sheeple group that get in the long lines to do you know what. Then you may, I don't know. But anyway, let's look at this article a little bit. I think it's important because if you've got the worst case scenario as far as keeping the country alive is a full shutdown. That's food, everything, all the trains. And if you go back to the 90s, 91, when Bush did that, we had, I think, 100 different carriers involved. Now you're down to about 7, something like that. And the major ones is Union Pacific, and that's controlled by hedge funds via BlackRock. And one other one, I can't remember, BlackRock, maybe JP Morgan, I'm not sure, but big companies, maybe one of the largest in the world. And it's all about profits. And so, but that profit is not going down to the workers, and the working conditions are getting really bad. That's the problem. So we see the continuing downgrade of this nation's capabilities, and we know that's on purpose. So what will happen here? We will have to wait 21 more days to see that. But in that time, those 3 weeks, you need to think about shortages on everything that you use. Everything. Water, food, clothing, everything is shipped by train. If you depended on just 18-wheelers now, the nation would be in very bad shape, because a lot of, if you've ever driven to Arizona, California, especially around Highway 61 and out through there in 40, it's long, super long trains. It's a beautiful country, and these big tracks wind through the mountains and through the desert, and through the canyons. It's an amazing sight to see. I love that area of the country. But there's so much more on those trains than that can be hauled via the highway. So much on that one train going somewhere. Now, we know there's been a shutdown and over the last 2 years of many businesses. Only the top ones look like they're going to make it. The ones that are heavily involved in the swamp, most of them. So what are you going to do? That's what you need to think about. Of course, we've always talked about, having food and water, things like that. But other things too, you want to be able to hunt or fish or whatever you got to do, to feed your family, protect your family. Things like that. Are you ready to do that? Solar power is always a good kind of backup project, even a small one that can just keep your communications devices charged, a fan going, maybe a TV. You don't have to have the big ones, but just some way of keeping, to keep power going from a phone to CB radio, shortwave radio, something like that. You understand what I'm saying? Because things could get very bad very quickly. We've heard all the politicians talk about a dark winter. Now, if you want to look at, you can probably search it out. I was reading some article this morning about Macron over in France, and he was saying, forget the days of any type of luxury, and most of the things that you need. Forget that. Those days are over. He included food and water. And he said France is going to have to suffer to keep Ukraine free. And he caught a lot of hell about that, because France has been going downhill for a long time as far as the middle lower class. They're not very happy with that statement at all, because they've already been suffering. And now it's going to get worse. Think about that. And so it's a planet-wide movement that we're seeing. It says delays on U.S. railroads have been a growing problem for shipping agricultural products all year. Labor discussions are ongoing, with the grain industry concerned about a possible labor stoppage in mid-September. Guys, what is that? That's the height of the Midwest harvest. Let that sink in, the timing, everything being played out. And if you've never read the book or seen the movies, Atlas Shrugged, you will see this was all foretold, especially with the railroad industry. Just this week, the White House-appointed Presidential Emergency Board, called PEB, released a recommendation as part of the ongoing collective bargaining process. Both sides have 30 days, remember this article was last week, 30 days to accept the recommendations. If the two parties don't agree, the rail workers are allowed to go on strike as of September 16th. That's what the 60-day cooling off period is about, but there's concerns that Congress could come in here, step in again, and force a negotiation, force a settlement, force folks back to work. We don't know that. That's a very important question. Now, I'm going to link to this article, and in this small section here is a link to some of the presidential powers and some of the acts and all this. Very long, very, it'll give you a headache trying to read all the information in there. Or you can type in Bush steps in 1991 to avert train strike, and you'll get a backup history of what we're talking about. But it says Max Fisher, and you can click on this, it's a link again. Max Fisher, chief economist of the National Grain and Feed Association, called NGFA, has been watching the situation closely. He says the biggest takeaway from the emergency board's recommendation is a 24% wage increase over 5 years for rail labor. Guys, that's a poor raise, and they also have bad working conditions. Think about that over 5 years. That's not very much. You may be asking, and compare it to inflation now and how that will increase. You're really losing money again. You may be asking, where does that stand with respect to where the two sides were at? The rail carriers were at 17% for what they were offering, and rail labor and what they were requesting was 31%. So 24% is right in between those two figures. Will they take it? We don't know. It doesn't look like it's going to be a very well accepted settlement or negotiation. Now, while workers can legally go on strike starting September 16th, if they don't choose to adopt the board's recommendations, Congress can intervene if workers decide to strike. If history repeats itself, the last time we had a stoppage was in the early 1990s. It was actually 91. It was under Bush. It says, and I believe it lasted 1 day, maybe 2 days before Congress passed a bill prohibiting a lockout or a strike. Now, with the labor force now, it's totally different than the one in 1991. There was a thing called work ethics. In this generation, it's a very rare thing. You've got the good ones that stand out, and we're proud of a lot of them in this family. But there's a lot of folks that just want a handout or want their parents to take care of them, and they're 30s, 40-year-old, you know. So it's a different work ethic, and they're already unhappy because they're probably having to work. But they're saying, again, the big companies, the railroads really aren't running anything. Let me say it like that. BlackRock and them are taking every penny off the table. And just like the other major companies, they're getting ready for total shutdown. So just rake everything off the table, give it, and don't share it with the workers, and get ready for collapse. Seems to be a part of the mentality. We'll have to see. It says, essentially, the two sides had to then go back to work on reaching agreement. So Congress has a lot of power here. We would like to think they're going to exercise it, and we're certainly going to encourage them to exercise it, because stopping the railroads would be very, very bad for the agricultural economy. Again, this is coming from the agricultural community. Fisher says the railroads have been working to hire more workers, but considering the current labor shortage and shipping delays, he expects rail delays to last another year. The rail delays have already been bad. Some feed users report being just days away, now this is a week ago, from running out of feed. Those delays could be inevitable even if a strike is averted in September. Again, I will link to this article, but here in blue is a link that's inserted into this article. It says, trouble shipping grain and feed via rail far from over. Concerns now growing about possible worker strike at harvest. That's key. The timing is the worst possible time. Obviously, it could get worse if the trains were just to completely stop. But the service right now, even without a stop, he said, is just not the best. This is Fisher. There's still a lot of delays as far as bringing rail cars to facilities, pulling them and delivering them. So now the grain industry is still not in a good spot with respect to rail transportation. It says that there's tense labor negotiations. That's key. The April hearing in front of the STB gave a hint to how tense those labor negotiations could continue to be. Rail carriers pointed out how severely impacted they've been from what's been dubbed the Great Resignation, and the issues getting labor back up to speed. Certain rail carriers also outlined the plans in place to get labor back to necessary levels to operate efficiently and smoothly. And this is what I was talking about earlier. It says, however, rail workers place blame on the railroads, saying there's more to the story. Of course, there is. Mark Wallace, locomotive engineer and vice president of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, called BLET, North America's oldest rail labor union, testified during the STB hearing in April. Since 1984, 40 railroads have been reduced to 7 Class 1 carriers, now largely controlled by speculators. Like I said, I was thinking it was around 100, but they're saying 40 here. And who else? Now largely controlled by speculators and hedge fund investors. This culture of profit over safety, customer service, and the lives of railroad workers is now exposed as this network fails on a daily basis. Like I said, Atlas has already shrugged. Guys, there's already collapse across the industry. He says, I wish we could have gotten an agreement earlier in the process. This was from Union Pacific's Lance Fritz. His hands are tied, and probably he was appointed by the hedge funds. But the railroads and the union leadership were pretty far apart right now in terms of what we think is an appropriate settlement on wages. Think about that. You're less than 5% a year with the inflation rate 3 times that, or 4 times, or 5 times 4.5% a year increase. Really? With the profits the hedge funds are raking off the top. These talks involved nearly 115,000 union rail workers and more than 30 railroads, and started in 2020 when the new administration came in. And a lot of other things started then too. But it says a BNSF train derailed between Heifer, Texas and Dawn, Texas early Wednesday morning. While the cause is still unknown, that was the image we looked at the beginning of this. On-the-ground reports say pieces of the track were scattered around where the rail cars derailed and piled up. Photos show the aftermath of the accident. Sources from around the Hereford area describe the part of the rail line as extremely busy, with a train passing that spot nearly every 15 minutes. BNSF can confirm that at approximately 5 a.m. Central Time, an eastbound intermodal freight train derailed 17 cars northeast of Heifer, Texas. Says a communication spokesperson told Farm Journal this. There was no injuries to the train crew. Our teams are on site with equipment to clear the area and restore the track. The estimated time to reopen our first train was mid-afternoon. That's very fast. They have equipment that can get there quickly via rail and via road. We've also got this, at that period of time, triple-digit heat, and it will buckle the rails. Maps of the BNSF routes show that specific lines run as far west as California, even leaving the port of Los Angeles, a port known as one of the world's busiest seaports and a leading gateway for international trade in the Western Hemisphere. So you really don't know what happened there. You got heavy traffic, you got triple-digit heat. It was fixed very quickly also. Now these are current images, 12:43 p.m. Central Time today as I'm doing the video, when we're maybe about to get a break from this river of rain, guys, because it has been pretty wet, damp, and like I mentioned in the last video, kind of miserable in the fact that, especially if you live on a farm and you're used to being outside a lot, and now it's nothing but mud out there. That sucks, that's just honest. But I'm not complaining about the rain. Never will I do that, looking at the droughts around the world. But it will be nice to have a few days of sunshine, and maybe that's what we're seeing here. My reason for coming here, though, is I want to reach out to everyone that can see this video or listen to the video and ask about the current conditions leading up to harvest that you know about in your area, whether regardless of the grain or whatever's being grown. I know there's more soybeans than corn being grown, even here in Mississippi, because corn takes 3 times the amount of fertilizer to grow than soybeans. And when you're dealing with the cost that's going up from $150 an acre to $600 an acre for your fertilizer, that's a tremendous savings. And anyway, that's what we're seeing. But I'd like to hear from all of you guys, anywhere you're at, not just here in the U.S. and Mexico and southern Canada, but anywhere in the world. Let us know, because it's going to take, especially with the media ignoring a lot of these things, it's going to take a collective group of us to really, to where we can spot that turning point. Are we at it right now as harvest begins? And I saw in Europe, guys, where they had tremendous damage to the corn crop. They had the drought come in, that's drying up the rivers before the corn could mature on thousands and thousands of acres, and so it just dried up on the stalk. Things like that. Let us know, because then we can put together the picture better. So if you'd like to share information, do that. Now let's kind of widen this out and look at what we got in the Atlantic. We're going to go to from the National Weather Service to the National Hurricane Service. We've got a system that's about to enter into the Caribbean here. It's 0% chance now, but once it crosses the island, if we go to the 5-day forecast, or the island chain, it goes to a 20% chance of cyclone formation. It's near the Windward Islands. Well-defined tropical wave is moving across the Windward Islands while producing disorganized shower and thunderstorm activity. The system is expected to move westward at about 15 miles per hour during the next several days, and environmental conditions could become more conducive for slow development when it moves across the central and western Caribbean Sea. It's on the track to possibly cross the Yucatan and come up into the Bay of Campeche, and we'll just have to see from there. This is out 5 days here. We'll just have to watch. I have noticed that the low pressure system that is over the mid-Atlantic is starting to weaken some. And when that does happen, the storms are allowed to push more in a north-northwest direction. So keep an eye on that. Now, this storm we've been watching here, let me change this view. Now, if you notice, the cone maps that we were just looking at were at 8 o'clock this morning Central Time, so it's almost 5 hours ago. And you can tell that here in the Caribbean, this storm has already started to cross the Windward Islands right there. This system here is not what they're watching. It's been there a few days. It's very large. But just south of the Azores, right here, these 4 white dots, this system that's rotating very good is on track to follow this storm into the Caribbean. Let's zoom in on both of them for just a moment. Now, this is a little easier to see. You can see the rotation at the surface right there, and it is starting to cross the Windward Islands as we speak. They're saying it will be in an area that will be more conducive for development. And if we look at the flow, I'm going to back this out a little bit. When we look at the flow of the currents, you'll see what I'm talking about. It appears that the high-pressure area over the Atlantic is starting to ease up somewhat, and it's going to allow the storm possibly to curve straight up into the Gulf. It could miss the Yucatan. Let's take a look at that. And guys, remember, it is that time of the year. We have not had a major storm. This water is very hot. And as a side note, guys, you want to see something I've never seen before that's blew my mind? It came out yesterday. Type in Navarre Beach, Florida, jellyfish. You couldn't see the water, guys. They looked like they were piled on top of each other. You couldn't even walk through there. There was a drone shot in one of the articles of a guy on like a paddle board, and he was surrounded. It was like a golden glob. There were so many. I've never seen that before. Again, Navarre Beach, Florida. I think it was yesterday. Check that out. Why is that happening? The water's way too hot. And so they're just breeding like crazy. But notice here, as I pause this, all the movement is coming here, coming up into the Gulf. Let me get that out of the way and just watch the currents and the lower level air patterns. Check that out. Even the higher clouds now. But it's just a flow there coming under Cuba, under Jamaica, and up into the Gulf of Mexico. And we've seen these storms skate between Cuba and the Yucatan many times. But that's what we're looking at here. Let's look at Africa. Now, looking at it closer, this is the system here just south of the Azore Islands coming off the African coast. And you can already see the rotation. And it's very tightly held together. If it continues that, notice it's just south of the Saharan sand layer. If it continues this path, it could break away from that altogether. Some of the top of the storm will absorb that. But I've seen this before, and over the last few years, you'll see one storm come off the African coast, absorb a lot of the sand layer, and another storm right behind it, kind of like the front storm was blocking. It was the blocker, and the running back was the second storm. You guys have seen it before also. And before I end the video, I want to go back to just the Gulf of Mexico satellite for a moment. You can see all this rain we're getting, guys. We're starting to see a little bit of lightning skies right now, hoping that the sun does not develop this line here too strong, because if you look at Jackson, Mississippi flooding in the national headlines, it was actually statewide. Some bridges washed out. Major interstates yesterday were closed because of water was coming across them, things like that. We really need a break right now. But notice, and that's why I came here, I was showing you on the Caribbean map this pattern of the movement of everything this time of the year, and that's what it usually is. But let's just watch that. See how everything's curving and heading north now? And if you got a front here, and it just depends on how long it stays here, that will curve the system with it as it moves east. But the problem with the storm is this circulation that you're seeing right here, which is dry to the left half of it, and it's been dry for a few days, it hasn't moved. And it's sitting there spinning, picking up Gulf moisture in the heat of the afternoon, and again, flash floods, flood warnings everywhere in the south. You guys right now in Florida, Mobile Bay, if you look at your local satellites, let me switch this over to a radar for just a moment. This will give you an idea of where the moisture in the storms are. Again, check this out from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, just south of us here, along the coast, Mobile Bay, Pensacola, you've been getting it for most of the week, really. And if you look very closely, you can see this underlying gray, the rotation is centered basically right here in Louisiana. It's spinning, dipping down into the warm, moist Gulf, and just reviving these storms day after day. Looks like we're starting to get a break here. You guys in southern Alabama, one of my favorite places, from Mobile Bay all the way to Perdido Key. I love it down there, and I got a lot of friends there. So I know you guys are getting wet, and you're sick of it, as I am, as far as the cabin fever aspect of not being able to get outside, because all of us in the South, we're outdoor people, whether it's on a sailboat, a fishing boat, on a tractor. Doesn't matter. We're outdoor people. And it really affects us. We're not people that are used to months like you guys in the north are, sometimes in the far north, where your months and having to deal with cabin fever, just a few days really messes up some of these old rednecks down here. But we may be starting to see a change. Again, notice the pattern of the movement of the storms and the waves and the winds in the Gulf now. So we're going to have to watch it, these next two storms. When they come up like this, we've seen them go straight into Louisiana, Texas. We've seen them turn very quickly, like Michael did, guys, and come in through Panama City and north of there. That's where we lost our 27-foot Hunter sailboat, if you remember, that we had. We did a lot of videos on that boat. But that's what we have now. We've got 3 weeks to watch the situation with the rail industry. Any of you folks out there that have friends, family that are work with the railroad or have knowledge of that, please share that in the comments below also. We'd appreciate it. We're watching it. You watch it. It's a heads up, guys. Be safe.